Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Election Tricycle. I'm Emily Tamkin in Washington, D.C., joined as ever by Rohan Venkat in Cairo.
Hello.
And Tom Hamilton from the UK.
Hello.
Now, as you know, if you are a regular listener of this podcast, we mostly look at our three countries, that is the US, India, and the United Kingdom, and our 2024 elections. But the big global election news this week was actually in the EU. The European Parliament had elections. And so we have a special guest with us today to unpack the results, and we will get to her in just a moment. But first, Tom has a D-Day dispatch, some D-Day discourse for us, a brief update on the state of the UK elections, which are July 4th. So Tom,
That's
what
right.
happened on D-Day?
Yeah, so we are deep into the UK election campaign now. Are we halfway through? I don't know, but we're getting there. We've got parties launching their manifestos this week, all sorts of things going on. But probably the most exciting new development was one of the biggest gaffes in British electoral history, which was it wouldn't be right to say that if you're Prime Minister, you have one job, because if you're Prime Minister, you have a hell of a lot of jobs and all of them are really hard. But if you're Prime Minister, you have one job, and it's to turn up to events where we pay tribute to the sacrifice of our forefathers in winning the Second World War, particularly if they're international events where the leaders of various other allied nations are present. So Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, turned up to the first part of the D-Day commemorations last week, the 80th anniversary of the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe, but he went off home early and missed the end. And it turned out that the reason he went off early, although he planned to go off early for various reasons, but the particular thing that he did when he went off early was to give an interview to ITV, which actually hasn't even been broadcast yet. It's going to be broadcast, I think, today or tomorrow, to make various party political points about the election. And to say this hasn't gone down well in the UK is an understatement. It's caused, I think, genuine shock that he thought it was appropriate not to go to the main part, the final part of the event. B, that he didn't want to go to the last part of the event. Someone said to me that, if Boris Johnson, this would have been the best day of Boris Johnson's life, hanging around with military people and veterans, watching flypasts, talking about World War II. But Sunak is clearly not his natural habitat. He didn't particularly want to be there. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, did go and stayed till the end. Partly, I think, because he couldn't really leave because of the various transport issues. But nevertheless, he did stay to the end, and that was a contrast that I think he didn't expect to be able to make. He wasn't going to make himself look better than Sunak, but he made himself look better than Sunak just by not leaving. And a lot of Tories have been shocked. Rishi Sunak went into sort of lockdown for the second weekend running. It's completely derailed their campaign in a way that wasn't very predictable. One of the weird things about it is that campaigning was going to be suspended for 2 days. The main leaders were going to D-Day. Everyone knew that was the main event, and there wasn't going to be anything party political. People were fine with that. And from a purely party political point of view, just going and standing with other world leaders to pay tribute to the sacrifice of World War II, that is a story that puts you at the top of the news if you're the Prime Minister and you look good. So even from a purely party political point of view, you just go and do it. There's no downside. So everyone's a little bit baffled by what's happened, but it has been hugely problematic for a party that wanted to stem the flow of votes to their right, to the Reform Party, which is playing on patriotism. I don't want to say militarism, that's not quite fair, but the same sorts of appeals to the kind of voters who think that D-Day is particularly important. He's talked about national service and having more young people go into the military, and the contrast with being able to say that he couldn't be bothered to turn up or at least to stay around for a military-connected event is really striking. So where we've got to now is that the Tories are now putting out ads and having their main message: we are going to be completely wiped out. Please don't let us be completely wiped out. We want to have some sort of opposition to the Labour Party. Don't have a complete landslide. It's not the most exciting positive message for a party to be using 3 weeks out from an election, but it is where we are.
I was going to make a quick point there, just in that I wondered if they were paying attention to the Indian elections at all, because as we discussed last week, the hubris of the winning side, or ended up actually it did work. This kind of like overconfidence side, but it still is not something the other side actively put out. It ended up working because of the overconfidence of the side that was expecting to win. It's really funny to see the Tories push on this so hard.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Tories, they are the underdogs in this election as far as all polling is concerned. But you're right that it's not being pushed by the other side particularly. Labour isn't putting out attack ads about D-Day. They're just not talking about it.
They're just trying not to trip between now and July 4th.
Exactly.
They're just well, Rishi Sunak was actually not the only European or world leader who had a bad week. There were others in attendance at the D-Day commemoration who also had a bad weekend, and we will turn to them now with our special guest.
I was just going to say we can move on from the liberation of Europe from the forces of fascism to talk about the European elections.
Exactly. So we are so excited to be joined by Zselyke Csaky. She is a senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform, which is a think tank devoted to improving the EU. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Okay, so let's just get right into it. The sort of top lines coming out of the EU elections were, well, so there was the immediate take, which was, oh my goodness, in the most populous countries in Europe, the far right did very well. Then there was sort of a corrective to that, which was, no, actually the center held. And then there was a corrective to the corrective that was, well, the center only held because center-right parties have taken far-right talking points. So if it wasn't a far-right party itself doing well, it was a center-right party that has sort of taken on the vocabulary and policy of far-right, of their far-right rivals. What was your snap judgment, your takeaway? What's the headline from you coming out of this past weekend's elections?
Well, I think that's, on the one hand, is a really good summary of where the conversation is right now. And on the other hand, I think it's good that we are speaking right after the UK and the upcoming UK elections, because European Parliament elections are at least as puzzling as the upcoming UK elections.
Right.
I think on the one hand, and let me just perhaps start by that there are a lot of misconceptions about the European Parliament. And I think it's useful to clear up a few of them. One is that the EP is as powerful as national parliaments. This isn't really the case. So in EU speak, it's a co-legislator, which means it cannot really initiate legislation. It's not like national parliaments. It's the Commission, so the executive arm, that initiates legislation, but then the Parliament, the EP, is needed for approving much of that legislation. Second, then it is just like national parliaments. In that sense, not really, because there is no government and opposition side in the European Parliament. It's a consensus machinery. Of course, it's very important to have a majority. That is how it works. It's important for lawmaking. It's important for policy. But it's not the fact that the side that won is the governing side, and then there is an opposition.
Right.
And then perhaps just a third thing, which is that it's stable like national parliaments. Again, there is a lot of switching sides, or compared to national parliaments, quite a bit of switching sides between MEPs, members of European Parliament. And we may see that happening right now. So then just for perhaps top line, my top line takeaway is that this was really 27 different elections and not one election. And I think many have said it, but the fact is that people are voting mostly on domestic issues because they are not voting on transnational lists. They are voting for their MEPs locally, nationally, who will then represent them in the European Parliament. There was a lot of talk about transnational lists, and I think it would be a good idea. Longer term, I'm not sure the new parliament would be supportive of that, but anyway, so it's complicated. And I think that's why there's a lot of confusion about whether this far-right surge happened or not. On the one hand, because yes, far-right parties have been more successful. When you look at their representation in the parliament, it will grow from 18 to around 24%. far right and hard right, I should say. Again, that's an important distinction. So that's definitely a change. But they will not have party groupings. They will not have representation at the level of party groupings that is this significant right now. So you have these EU parties, which are made of the national parties, and the ones that represent hard right parties are the ECR, the European Conservative and Reformists, and the ID, Identity and Democracy. And these have grown, not as much as expected. And then, of course, like one party, the FD, has been fired from the ID. And so there are parties that are currently not in any of the grouping, but are far right or hard right. So the ones that are not part of a member group don't have that much power in the parliament because they don't have access to the same resources.
Right.
They don't get speaking time. They don't get offices, for example. So in that sense, there hasn't been a far-right takeover. I think that's clear. The center kind of held because the two main party groupings, the conservatives and the socialists, got as much as before. The conservatives, even the EPP, got more votes. But then again, the far right did make gains. So it's. I think it's a wash, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also important to know that that, as you were saying, perhaps at the beginning, that these elections then had downstream effects for national politics, and that's the other part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a country that used to have European Parliament elections, and is this the first set that the UK has been out of? It's probably the second set that the UK has not been part of. But those elections very much had downstream effects in the UK, and some of those involved parties that some people would think of as far right, certainly hard right. If you got the UK Independence Party that no longer exists in that form. It was really clear that those elections, although they were sometimes about Europe, they were fought very much on domestic concerns and had enormous domestic effects in terms of bringing down governments. In some cases, Theresa May fell for various reasons, but it was the European elections of 2019 that was sort of the thing that knocked her off. But there have been really important downstream effects this time, and France is probably the most obvious one. And does what Macron has done seem to you like is it an overreaction, or is it a rational response to what's just happened?
That's a very difficult question. I think there are really two sides. So Macron basically called snap elections for the assembly. France is a presidential system, so this is not for the president, obviously. But it's still very important because the Rassemblement National, so Le Pen's party, won big in the European Parliament elections, and likely, or it seems like they can be successful in these quote-unquote parliamentary elections. And so Macron was basically saying, well, people have voted in a dumb way. Let's give them the real chance to vote in a national election where they will see the results or the consequences of their vote. I think it's an enormous gamble. And I think it really comes down to people's risk taking and preferences around that, whether they think it's a good idea or not. I think it can go either way. I generally, however, don't really think that. I think the assumption behind Macron's idea is that this was a protest vote mostly, or that people voted for Le Pen's party because they were unhappy with other things, but they don't really think it seriously. They don't really consider it an actual vote. And I think what we see from research is that often voters of hard right, far right, or populist parties, yes, there is a segment that is a protest vote, but most of them vote for these parties because they agree with many of the ideas. Like they vote on an ideological basis. And so in that sense, I am really uncertain whether this will pay off well for Macron. And of course, if Rassemblement National wins, then that will be a difficult period for France going forward, because that will mean a cohabitation. And that will be a difficult period for Europe going forward, because like one of the key countries will sort of be missing in action, or will be bogged down by domestic crises. But I'm also happy to talk about the other domestic consequences. I think the other big story for the other big member state was Germany, where there haven't been any resignations so far. But it was the worst result for the governing SPD party. And the AfD, the far-right party, did worse than expected, but still relatively well, better than 5 years ago. I think they went from 11 parliamentarians to 15 in the current parliament. So that's significant, and some are saying that early elections may be coming for Germany. Otherwise, the elections are scheduled for next year. And then perhaps just one third thing, if I may mention. So we don't just talk about the big member states, because I think often people think European elections, oh, it's France and Germany. Maybe Spain, maybe Italy. But I think it's important that in Hungary, there was an unexpected result where the governing Fidesz party lost quite big. They achieved their worst result in European elections ever. That still means that they got 43%, so it's quite significant. But then there is a new upstart party, which was founded 2 months ago. This is the party of Péter Magyar, who is the ex-husband of the former justice minister. So this is an insider who is basically unhappy with the system. And his party, the TISA party, got 30%. I think it can probably be qualified as a record in European elections, that a party that was founded just 2 months ago got 30% in a national election. So this will be significant for them going forward, and they may be able to challenge Orbán long term, though that's really unclear at this point, because the national elections are in 2026.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a question about demographics? Because one of the real characteristics of the UKIP, Brexit Party, Reform Party vote, they're all the same party, they just keep changing their name, in the UK, is that it's quite an old vote, an older electorate. And parties of the, I want to be careful about the word far right in a UK context, but parties that are in over in that direction have had very little youth appeal in the UK. That could easily change, but that's where we are at the moment. That, I think it's fair to say, but I'd like to know what you think about this, is less true in Europe, and the far right is quite attractive to younger voters. And I was wondering, well, I guess three things. One, is that right as a broad generalization? Two, why is that? And three, what sort of strategies are being adopted to try and deal with it?
Right. So I think on the one hand, there is no uniform European picture. Yeah. But you can say that far-right parties do draw in more of the youth vote, or have done in this election. I think there were a lot of reports, articles ahead of the election about the appeal for the far-right. And I think it's clear in many countries, not in all countries that are covered, but it's clear in many countries that young people have started voting for far-right parties. I think at the same time, you have to look at this trend comparatively, because I think in most cases, they are just catching up to the average voter. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, young people used to vote more liberal or more progressive in most cases. I think the big green victories 5 years ago in the European Parliament, those were in large part thanks to this youth vote. And what we are seeing right now is that young voters are more similar to the average voter in many countries. But on average, I think, although I haven't seen comparative research, but on average, it seems they are still quite similar to middle-aged and old voters. And so The other thing about why they are shifting to the right, again, on that, I would say it's similar to the reasons behind other voters' preferences. We also see women, which used to vote somewhat more progressive, shift more to the right. And I think it's partly the long tail of COVID, of the war, and the energy crisis. These haven't really been addressed. And then partly perhaps on the European level, there's been a backlash against the Green Deal, and that migration still is a divisive issue. So in that sense, I would just say that yes, young voters may vote more far right, hard right, but they are quite similar to the average voter.
I have two more questions for you, but I want to give Rohan a chance to get in here.
Yeah, I recognize the complexity of talking about this election. I mean, even in India, where we have, you can argue a bunch of smaller elections. At least we do have an overarching narrative that's fairly easy to put together. And I recognize it's quite complex here. But I wanted to pick on something that you mentioned there specifically about the Greens and the difference between 5 years ago and now. The Columbia economic historian Adam Tooze points out that if you had to look at one of the big changes between 5 years ago and now, it is that this far right increase has been seen with a decrease of green representation, and it could seriously impact what the Commission and the European project means in the next 5 years. So I wanted to get a sense of what's on the table. What could this actually mean for Europe? You mentioned migration. You mentioned climate. I'd get a sense of what does it mean for it to take even this center right, far right thrust.
Right. Yeah. So in terms of implications on policy, perhaps I would start with the Green Deal and with climate in general, because there's a lot of talk about that. Our assessment at the CER is that this election is important, but it is unlikely to change things in the short term, because many of those policies on the Green Deal have already been agreed upon. So right now is the implementation phase, which means that they will have to be translated into local laws, national laws, and that is where there may be some trouble ahead. But it's unlikely that this big package of legislation will be completely rolled back. So in that sense, the most likely scenario is that there isn't a lot of progress going forward, which is not good news, because there's a lot to do on the climate crisis. And long term, that perhaps countries are not really implementing these laws the way that they should be. But that's perhaps the pessimistic scenario. And then, of course, I mean, on migration, there isn't a lot that may change, again, because on migration, there was also a large package deal that was adopted just recently, which is this Migration and Asylum Pact, which is quite right-leaning already. So the fact that the new parliament has shifted more to the right will not influence that a lot. These policies are already somewhat right-leaning, focusing on a reduction in the number of asylum seekers and focusing on deals with third countries. That may continue going forward. And then I think perhaps the third point, which will be very important, is what happens with Ukraine and support for Ukraine. And I think, again, what is most likely is that short term, not much will change, partly because the part of the hard right, so the ECR, is quite supportive of Ukraine. The parties in that grouping are quite supportive of Ukraine. So there isn't an expected big change. Longer term, however, I think everyone is waiting for the election in the US. Everyone is waiting to see whether Trump gets elected or not. And if that does happen, then the big question will be, will Europe be able to support Ukraine, and will these European parties and will these member states want to foot the bill, want to support Ukraine? Because then the real cost of doing that will fall on Europe mostly. And that will be a major issue going forward. But we don't expect much change until then, and even afterwards, it will probably be a slow process.
Right. Okay, so two last things from you for me. The first is the other place that I saw that sort of cut against the overall we're lurching to the right narrative was Poland, which was also a place where not too long ago it was, oh my goodness, law and justice and the capture of the state and the Populist Party. Last year the centrists come back, and this year, unlike some other places where it was like, okay, well, this is who we vote for nationally, but for the EU we're going to send a message to the government. It's my understanding that the centrists did quite well. So why do you think Poland kind of went in a different direction than some other? I mean, it's interesting because in some ways it's the reverse of the conversation that I think many in so-called Western Europe would prefer to have, where it's like, the backward Central and Eastern Europeans, like what's happening to them, to democratic backsliding and populism. That was not the case in this election. So I guess can you enhance our understanding of what happened with Polish voters?
Right. Yeah. I think if I wanted to joke, I could just say that democratic backsliding or the far right is relevant because it finally came to Western Europe. But,
yeah,
but that's not fully true.
Right.
I think it's hard to say. I think the one through line that we can say about Poland and Hungary is that it seems like established far-right parties or established hard-right parties have disappointed in this election. And so in Poland, yes, as you were saying, the Law and Justice, which was ousted from power last year, did worse than expected. They were supposed to be first, and this was the first time that they did not finish first in an election. But at the same time, yes, the centrists won. But there is this other far-right party, Confederacja, which was really successful. So it seems like it's a half empty, half full glass.
Right.
Where, yes, the progressive or centrist party succeeded, but then those protest votes or those far-right voters chose another party to send a message to Brussels, which was Confederacja.
Okay, so here's my real question for you, which is, I remember during the Italian election, Italian journalists and commentators were very frustrated that outsiders were making this election all about fascism because of how well Meloni was doing. And they were saying, no, it's really more about, Italians being more involved in their democratic process. And it's more a protest about how things have been done. And that's all well and good. But the reality is that Meloni came to power and set about, bringing those who criticize her government to court, right? And pushing conservative, not just conservative, I would argue right-wing policies. And I guess I had a similar thought listening to people talk about, why people vote for Alternative for Deutschland, or why a party that was founded by a Nazi in the 1950s in Austria did so well, right? Like, it's all well and good to say, well, it's a protest vote, or, oh, you don't really understand, it's about our complicated domestic issues. But the reality is you just voted for a very right-wing party that's going to, that will have consequences somewhere down the line, right, in the either transnational or national context. How do you sort of think about these two? Because the people, like, it's true to say it's a protest vote, right? I understand that. It's true to say that people are unhappy. It's true to, but the way the protest manifests is to vote for right-wing or hard right or far right politicians and the policies they're promising. So how do you sort of think about these two things? How do you hold these two truths at the same time?
Yeah. That's a really good point. I think on the one hand, when it comes to protest vote, you can say that these people, let me just go back to this thought. I lost it because it was just on the tip of my tongue. But because I wanted to refer to a research article, but okay, anyway, I may come back to that if it comes back to me. So I think, yes, it's not necessarily true to say that this is just a protest vote. I think often the European Parliament elections are called these second-order elections, And that means that they are not that important. So people are more willing to vote for parties that otherwise they wouldn't vote for. I think we have to be careful with that phenomenon. And I think this partly just shows that people are voting for these parties because they are unhappy with mainstream parties. So you can call that a protest vote, or you can just call that an actual vote, an
Right.
unhappiness with mainstream parties. And I think that happens partly because mainstream parties fail to deliver on many of the important issues for these voters. So there was this interesting research a few years ago which showed that young people's support for democracy recovered when a populist party came into power in the first few years of that populist party, and they were more willing to vote for that populist party before. And the reason for that likely is that that populist party actually started talking about the issues that these voters were interested in and started coming up with some measures. Perhaps those are measures that are not good measures, but still, they started dealing with those problems. So I think it's partly a reason behind young people's and other voters' disappointment that mainstream parties don't deliver, and partly it's frankly a narrative question as well. For such a long time, one of the main messages of mainstream parties has been, well, we are not the far right. There's a danger of the far right taking over. Need to defend Europe. Need to defend the status quo. I don't think it's attractive to that many voters at this point. I think many are saying, well, we have defeated them last time around, not much changed. There is the economic crisis. I have problems that need to be addressed, and you did not do anything. So in that sense, I think that explains this willingness, and I think it's more and more important to take that vote seriously because longer term it may just grow.
Right. Before we let you go, we close with a cycle for our main section before we get to our premium section, which we will let you and our regular listeners go, and premium listeners stick around. Before we let you go, we have a segment called Tricycle Recommends, where we each recommend a piece of writing or an article or something that we came across in the last week that we think our listeners should read. And it can be your own work if you have something. So what would you like to share with our tricycle listeners? What are you recommending for them?
Well, I mean, I will be plugging our own research for
Perfect.
one, which is this new insight that came out on the CER's website, which is heavily policy focused. So if you're interested in more in-depth analysis about the implications of these elections on the Green Deal, on defense or security, then please do read it. And then the other article I think I would recommend is Natalie Tocci's op-ed, I think today in The Guardian or yesterday, which tries to put these results into a broader context. And she basically says that the center holding is not necessarily good news because of all the challenges that Europe will have to face over the next several years. That just means that Europe is ill prepared to face those challenges. I think it's a good read.
Tom?
So I'm going to not quite recommend my own work, but I'm going to recommend some work that some of my colleagues have done that came out today, which is the big story in a UK context at the moment is that the Tories are saying, we're going to lose by a landslide, it's a disaster, don't let that happen, which is quite a funny line for a party to be running as its top argument in any election. But my colleagues at the company that I work for did some polling on this and asked people, so do you think that the Tories deserve to lose all their seats in the next election? And it turns out that almost half of voters think that the Conservatives do deserve to get 0 seats, including 24%, so basically a quarter of people who voted Conservative at the last election in 2019 believe that the Tories deserve to get no seats, which is a pretty extraordinary result of a poll, I think, although I've not seen comparable polling done at previous elections, so we can't quite compare it to what they might have thought in the past. But so yeah, my colleague Seb Ride has written a really interesting blog on some of these findings. It's not just those questions. There's quite a few other questions about what do people actually think? What result do they want? How many seats do they really want the Tories to get? How scared are they of the idea of a big Labour landslide? And the answer is whether they should be or not, they're not scared of a Labour landslide. They do want to see the Tories totally wiped out. And a Tory message that says we're going to be totally wiped out may well be met by voters going, all right then, we can cope.
Good. Rohan.
Given that we did, I promoted my own work last time more in pointing to a whole bunch of other things on India, and in sort of in the spirit of this conversation, I instead wanted to point folks to that little sphere of the internet, which is Macronology, in the Kremlinology sort of sense. So 3 sets of Twitter, X threads, trying to figure out what Macron was doing in his decision to call assembly polls. Those are by journalists and commentators Katie Lee, Georgina Wright, and Rim Mumtaz, all of which I found fairly interesting in different ways. Not all of which agree with each other, but there's interesting commentary there. We'll stick links up. They're all trying to read through the tea leaves of Macron's decision.
And I'm going to step on Rohan's turf and recommend something. It's about India, but I think it really resonated with me as an American reader. It's basically about the debates that were happening around the founding of the founding of India, about caste, about Hinduism, and really about how much of the country that you want to see can be legislated into existence, and how much of it is born through practice as opposed to written legislation. So I think it's the New York Review of Books. It's a gorgeous essay. We'll put it in the show links. And I really encourage you, wherever you are in this world, if you are interested in thinking about democracy and how it comes into being and stays, to read it. So with that, Zselyke, thank you so much for joining us today to speak about EU elections and to share your insight analysis. It's always great to talk to you. And we appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.